Newsfirst, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat.
Hello, good evening and a very warm welcome. Sorry for that unexpected start, I wasn't told. Today, Sri Lanka, our protests intensify as indeed the crisis deepens. To talk about that, we've got here the convener of the Medical Professionals Sri Lanka for System Change, Professor Indika Karunathilake, who of course is no stranger to our program. Very good evening to you, Professor. Thank you for coming again to our program.
Good evening to you, Franz.
Now then, the protests are sort of intensifying. We see all sorts of protests. Does this mean, obviously, I suppose it means the crisis is deepening. Talk to me about what's the protest about the taxation?
Yes, currently there is a lot of concerns, especially among the professionals, regarding the new changes in taxation that has come to effect from the early part of this year. And the concerns are basically, one is that it is not fair, and secondly, it is not going to be effective, and thirdly, it's going to have a lot of negative implications. Having said that, I think professionals, we have to very clearly mention that professionals are not against taxation, because we believe, as professionals who have came through the free education and free health system of this country, we have obligation to this country. So professionals are not against taxation. But what professionals are against is the lack of transparency and the unfair nature. For fair
taxes?
Yes, yeah. I mean, if you think about if Sri Lanka can have a fair system, fair and equitable system with transparency and accountability, that is what the professionals are asking for. But we don't think the current changes are fair or effective, or it's going to have any meaningful benefit for the country's economic recovery.
How would you achieve the equitable nature of taxes? And what would your proposal be for that?
Yes, yeah. Now, one argument about Sri Lanka's taxation is that Sri Lankan taxation is not very high, it's very low. That is what is said. And if you take countries like Scandinavian countries, sometimes the taxation can be maybe 36% or even more. However, the difference in Sri Lanka is that most of the taxation in Sri Lanka comes through indirect taxation. For example, even if someone goes to a boutique and buy a loaf of bread, still you are taxed. Actually, a lot of taxation comes through indirect taxation. And the small amount is direct taxation. The other thing is the benefits that people are getting. If you take any other country, like a developed country where the taxation is high, the benefits are also there for the people. For example, people get good quality education, health system, transport, so on and so forth. Basically, the taxation system is very accountable. People know what happens to every cent or dollar that they pay as taxes. But in Sri Lanka, it is not the case. What is happening to the indirect taxation, we don't know. And what's happening to direct taxation also, we don't know. So that's the main issue, that the lack of transparency. Secondly, the current changes. If I may briefly explain what are the current changes is, now previously also there was the pay taxation for the professionals.
Yeah.
And that was based on the basic salary, and that was a fair taxation system. And the professionals were also they didn't have any complaints or any issues about.
When you say fair, are you still talking about the transparency? Or are you talking about the level of tax?
The level of taxation. There I am talking about the level of taxation.
Okay.
Here also I am referring to the level of taxation. Because at that time actually there was no, say if you take 2019 or beyond, there were no issues from the professionals. I mean, they were quite happy about paying taxes. Actually, professionals were quite proud about paying taxes because that's as an obligation. But this time there were some fundamental differences. For example, this time the payment for the professionals or the employees is taken in the same category like the profit for the businessman. Previously it was not so, because there was some employment allowance that was left based on the understanding that the professionals need to, or the employees need to spend some amount on their professions, for example the transport and other expenses. But here the whole salary is taxed. The full salary is taxed, and one fundamental difference is it is considered as same as the benefit from the businesses, the profit from the businesses. That is not. They are two different areas. Another example is now the cost of living allowance. Cost of living allowance is given as based on the premise that the expenses of living is high. But in this scheme, even that is taxed, because the whole salary is taxed. And there are a lot of non-financial benefits that are taxed as well. And that also, now certain non-financial benefits are given for the service. For example, a doctor who is working in a faraway area, they are given quarters because they are living in that area. And sometimes a doctor who is working in a rural area, or maybe a government officer who is working in a rural area, they might have to go into faraway areas. There they need the vehicle allowance, or maybe transfer facility, or maybe a vehicle. So those facilities are required to carry out the job. But in the current situation, they're being
taxed on that too.
They are also being taxed. There were some changes that were basically announced today, because I think it was due to the pressure that was put on. But generally the principle was the whole salary and also the non-financial benefits are taxed. So there are certain fundamental errors there. The one issue that I have mentioned, that it is considered like the same as the profit from the business. Secondly, even the cost of living allowance is also taxed. And thirdly, what I mentioned, the facilities that are given to you to provide a good service, that are also taxed. So this is like punishing for working. I mean, if a doctor goes to a rural area, maybe visiting a pregnant mother in a rural village and using...
So that's where you say it's unfair.
That's one way I'm saying is unfair. Secondly, the taxation slabs and the ceilings. For example, the lower margin for non-taxation or the tax allowance is 100,000 rupees per month. But if you take the current country situation and the depreciation of the rupee, 100,000 is almost bordering on the poverty level. So, I mean, that is basically not an acceptable upper margin for non-taxation. Secondly, the percentages, because when the percentages are like multiples of 6, for example, starting is 6%. So when you start with the 6% with 100,000 and 150,000, it may not be much. But when you go high up, and those slabs are also very narrow. So when you go high up, it can go up to maybe multiples of 6, like 6%, 18%, 25%, and up to 30%. So when you apply that into the salary, it becomes a huge amount. And also, now if you have spent on, say, now most of the professionals or most of the employees, they buy their houses, they build their houses or the vehicles through the loans, the bank loans. And when they get bank loans, that also by showing the whole salary. So that bank loan is also deducted, but that is not considered into the taxation. So sometimes there may be situations that someone is getting the salary, but ultimately it may be almost a negative amount, because what you get as the loan also tax. At the same time, the loan interest has gone up, the rupee has depreciation, and what you have saved as EPF and ETF, that's also have been basically wiped out because of the depreciation of the rupee. So all these things taken together, ultimately there will be a negative impact on the employees. So that's why we are telling it's unfair.
Now, do you think that the government have listened then to the protests?
I don't think so, because there have been several press conferences, there have been some meetings with the finance ministry authorities, there were several statements, and there were several requests for meetings. But so far, the stance has been rather rigid, saying that we are not going to make any changes, and this is what the IMF has recommended. But that's also, there's lack of transparency, because no one has really seen what's the staff level agreement for IMF was. No one has seen. We don't really know. And also there were some small changes that have been made.
This is the latest...
the latest changes. So in one hand, the authorities are telling that it cannot be changed. At the same time, there are some changes made in response to the protest and the pressure that is put on. So what we can learn from that, it is something that can be changed. So that is what the professionals are also asking. We are not asking not to have tax. What we ask is make it fairer. For example, now at the moment the upper margin is 100,000. You can make it 200,000.
Yeah.
And also the percentages, rather than going for very high percentages, you can have the multiples of 4, like 4%, 12%, so on and so forth.
And where would the top be then?
Then in that way, maybe like something like, say, 16.
Right.
16 or maximum maybe 24, like that. So in that way, and also the tax slabs, the gap between where the percentages increase also be narrowed a little bit. In that way, the government can also get a reasonable income. At the same time, the professionals will not be unfairly taxed. Because now, why we are telling this one is, this is not fair, other one is not, this is not going to have any impact. Again, the reason is, if you take the monthly expenditure of the government, is something like, say, 600 billion. If you take the loan interest also into play, something like, say, 600 billion. The general wages and everything may be something like 300 billion rupees. So the total amount what the government is expecting from these taxes is about 70 billion per year. But again, it might not happen, because the highest that the government has got from these taxes was in 2019, that was 49 billion. So this time it is, what the government is expecting is more than twice. But it's quite unlikely, because the highest was 49.
You think it's unrealistic?
Quite unrealistic, because the government mechanism of taxation is not very efficient. Because now this is
What do you mean? You mean the collection?
The collection, of course, is not very efficient, because I'll tell why. Because now it's very easy to collect taxes from the salaried employed, because it's salaried and it is basically accounted, it's documented, so you can easily count. But there are so many other, say, if you take, there are so many businesses, but if you take the number of businesses in the country, only few are taxed, only few are VAT registered. Maybe maximum about 15,000 businesses in the country are VAT registered. And they are also very small amount of paying the taxation. So therefore the mechanism is not very efficient. This is a way to get the easy way for a particular category, because you can unfairly tax a particular category, and that's quite easy because that's documented. So you can basically cut from the salaried point, but it may not be applicable for many others. So in that way also, that is not fair. Other one what I was trying to tell was, even if you take the government expenses for a month, like even if you assume like 400 billion rupees, if the government is getting only 5 billion rupees from that per month, that's what the realistic target. So if that is so, it's not going to make any difference for the expenses. It's not going to make any bridges into the between the difference between the income and the expenditure. That's why we are telling it's not effective. At the same time, there are many other categories where you can get better taxation. One example is the invoicing, the export invoicing. Now, many businesses, now even the previous finance minister said that Sri Lanka loses about $40 billion, not rupees.
$40 billion?
Dollars, not rupees.
Yeah, $40 billion.
Due to illegal invoicing. So that's a huge amount. I mean, that amount is adequate to bring fuel for the country for the whole year. And even with the surplus.
$40 billion is about 50% of our total GDP.
That's the thing. I mean, that's why we are telling there are, I mean, if there's a genuine intention for economic recovery, then these are the measures. I mean, because a lot of experts, because of the incorrect and illegal invoicing, the money that should be coming to Sri Lanka is not coming. They are in the banks in other countries. I mean, this was told by none other than the former finance minister. I mean, so that's a huge issue. And also, if you think about the billions of dollars that have been taken as loans, and this is what we have to pay. And at the moment, we can't pay that because we have been basically declared bankrupt. So, I mean, all this amount, what has happened to that? What has happened to the stolen assets? Now, can't recover. So, there are international regulations. And if there are mechanisms to recover stolen assets, it has to be started by the government. The legal procedure has to be started by the government. But we don't see any attempt or even any intention to start about that kind of procedure. So there are many ways. There are many ways where you can basically contribute towards economic recovery. Because what the government will be getting from, even from this very unfair taxation, is actually very small fraction of the gap between the income and expenditures. So that's the issue.
Thank you very much for your questions on by SMS or WhatsApp 0772 300 305. And here's one. What about the 40% of the families in Sri Lanka living on less than 100,000 a month? Why can't someone earning 140,000 pay 2,500 per month? On average, a professional earning 247,000 rupees pays 15,000 per month. Is that fair?
Okay, that's a very, very popular argument. It's a popular argument, but it's an incorrect argument, because ultimately what will happen is, whether you are a person who is having an income more than 100,000 or less than 100,000, you are going to be affected. You are going to be affected by this system. It can be either, if you are earning more than 100,000, it may be through the unfair taxation percentages, so on and so forth, where you will be paying very high, sometimes very high salary, sometimes taxation, sometimes it can be resulting in almost a negative salary on one way. On the other hand, those who are not paying direct taxation, they pay indirect taxation. Like I have mentioned, even some person goes to maybe a boutique and buy a pair of loaf of bread, again you are paying taxations. Actually, 80% of what you pay, about 70%, 70% of our taxation is indirect taxation. So everyone pays taxes. And by increasing this tax percentage, the indirect taxation are not going to decrease. Because of the cost of living, the increase of tariffs and the depreciation of the rupee, the indirect taxation percentage will not decrease. Therefore, there will not be benefit for those who are earning less. On the other hand, there's another thing that we are not really looking at. For example, now when those who are getting higher salaries, when that tax very high, then they have to cut down on their expenses. In the Sri Lankan situation, if you take an employee or professional, there are a lot of others who are living or basically benefiting from them. And basically, sometimes they depend on them. For example, in the current situation, maybe let's take a couple of professionals. Sometimes the current situation in the Sri Lankan setup, they might have to get the help of a domestic. And because of that, because of the salary that domestic person is getting, there may be another family living. And also, if the employees have to cut down in their normal expenses, leisure and whatever, all these things may be transport, then again, what will happen is the local economy will be shrinking. Then ultimately, who will not be benefiting or who will be ultimately suffering will be the people who are having low income.
Right.
Previously, when the employees were getting better salaries or maybe the taxes are not that high, definitely there is no argument about paying taxes. Employees will not be unhappy about paying even up to maybe 25,000, 30,000. There people will not be very unhappy. But
let's come back to it, Professor.
If I can finish a little bit.
Yeah, we need to go for a break. We'll come back after the break. Time now to take a peek at this evening's headline news from the Primetime News team. See you on the other side of the break.
Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
News First Headlines. Main sponsor.
Durden's Hospital, dedicated to you.
President opens new session of Parliament. Wickremesinghe speaks on rising out of bankruptcy in 2026, the devolution of power within a unitary state, and reviving the country over penalizing those who led it into a crisis. Biden to strengthen anti-fraud strike forces and assures taxpayers get back at least 10 times for every dollar put into fighting fraud. Freedom People's Congress walk out ahead of President's statement to Parliament. SJB and NPP boycott the sessions. Mahasangha marched to Parliament against the attempt to fully implement the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Electricity, petroleum, ports and water supply trade union protest against unjust tax policy. Professionals, trade unions warn of strict action if taxes are not revised. Multiple non-cash benefits removed from payee tax category.
News First Headlines. Main sponsor.
Durdens Hospital, dedicated to you. Experience the best in healthcare at Durdens Hospital's new Alfred Place wing. We continue to evolve into a purpose-built hospital of the future, with an ambience built to deliver world-class care. Durdens Hospital, dedicated to you.
ඔබ අභියෝගයට සූදානම්ද? තරුණ නායකයින් සඳහාම එන්න අපි නායකත්වය ගැන කතා කරමු.
V-Force Young Leaders Forum.
ස්ටයින් මැදිරි සංකීර්ණයේදී ඔබ අදම ලියාපදිංචි වන්න. 0777 6020.
ගම්මැද්ද V-Force.
අරමුණ දිනන පෙරමුණ.
Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
And welcome back to Newsline Live. And my guest this evening is Professor Indika Karunathilake, who's telling us all about unfair and inequitable taxes. Professor, perhaps we can finish off what you were saying before.
Yeah, thank you. Because what I was trying to say is when the professionals and employees are getting a reasonable salary, I mean, lot of professionals were actually getting a reasonable salary compared to the Sri Lankan economy, so on and so forth. Then there was a system where the money was flowing into those who are getting lesser income. Through your services, so on and so forth. For example, maybe building a house, or maybe having a driver, or maybe a domestic, or maybe even going to maybe the market and buying something. So in all these ways, there was a way where money was flowing into those who have lesser income, and in a way it has helped the local economy. But in this situation where even the professionals would struggle to make ends meet, sometimes because of the loans that they have taken, so on and so forth, they might have only a very small amount, maybe something like 10,000 rupees per month, where they have to basically manage everything. So like I have mentioned, in many employees and many professionals, there is a kind of community who are dependent on them. Maybe the parents, maybe some relations, maybe the support workers. So all this, I mean, in that way the money was actually flowing and helping the local economy. But if this happens in this way, where the professionals themselves might find the ways to make ends meet, the local economy will collapse.
So they might not have a driver, they might not have a maid.
Perhaps no. I mean, if all that is remaining after the salary, maybe 20,000 rupees per month,
then you can only do so much.
Yeah, because I mean, in a way, professionals are basically, there is an allegation, there is too much of consumption, so on and so forth. But in the Sri Lankan situation, certain things have become like a must. For example, I mean, if we lived in a country where there's decent public transport system, professionals and employees could have used the public transport. But in a country where due to wrong decision making, so on and so forth, we don't have a decent public transport system. And similarly, childcare, all these areas. So in this situation,
as a doctor, as a medical man, would you say how good or bad or mediocre or whatever is our state medical services?
I mean, I would say state, in spite of all the difficulties and the challenges that we had over so many years, still state medical services is providing good care due to two reasons. One is the Sri Lanka has a well-established system, especially the preventive health system and the curative system. We have a very well-established system, mainly in the government sector and private sector also. And also I would like to pay tribute to the healthcare workers of the country, not only doctors but also other healthcare workers. They work tirelessly. And I mean, if you take the salaries that, if you compare with the other countries, I mean, the doctors in Sri Lanka basically gets very small amount, but still they are happy and they are working for the country. And also the doctors and other professionals. Because of that, still the state health sector is providing good service. But having said that, I don't know how long we can manage the situation, because the current situation, a lot of doctors and other health professionals migrating due to various reasons. And also, there are a lot of shortage of medicines.
I was about to ask you about the shortage. What about that?
Yeah, it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem. There are certain essential medicines that are not available and in the hospitals, and a lot of patients are asked to buy medicines from the pharmacies, and even equipments that are used for procedures and surgeries. So all these things, sometimes the patients will have to buy from the market because that's not available. Sometimes that is not even available in the market also because of the economic situation of the country. They are not imported. So it is a huge issue. There are certain essential medications that are in shortage, and it's a very pathetic situation. More so because the country has actually received enough donations that will be sufficient to get the essential drugs.
And back to taxation, there's a question from one of our viewers. How can we put a system to ensure that the tax money collected is utilized for genuine purpose instead of robberies?
I think that's very, very important, because I mean, what everyone is asking, what is happening to our tax money? Will this also go into some kind of black hole where we don't know, and I mean, some kind of benefit for someone which we don't intend to be? So, I mean, but other countries happen. So that's why, I mean, we are arguing for a transparent system. I mean, why can't we use an electronic system where each transaction can be monitored?
What do you make of what happened to that remise system?
That's what I'm asking. I mean, I mean, there is a possibility. There are people, there are professionals with enough capacity to develop such systems. And those systems, so they are also where you can link the NIC, the National Identity Card, into the transactions and everything. In that way, you can monitor the government sector, private sector, the employees, business, everything you can monitor easily. And you can put that into a transparent system. Then we were arguing for an independent tax commission, and then the tax ombudsman. So all these measures has to be there. If those measures are put in, then we can actually think that a more transparent and fair taxation system will be evolving, and everyone will be happy, and professionals will be very happy and will be very supportive. Of course, I think professionals will be very happy to support, even to establish that kind of system. This is not we in as doctors and medical professionals, but there are, even from the Department of Inland Revenue, the economic professionals, they are also telling that this system can be made more transparent, more equitable and more just.
Now, we mentioned earlier that the government maintained that these taxes were as ordered by that other doctor called IMF. But now, when they've changed the slab, or they've changed the rates and so on, does this mean that this is, in spite of what the government said, that this was ordered by the IMF, that these matters can be changed if the public feels so strongly about it?
I think so. Because one thing is, I mean, still there's again the issue of transparency comes into play. Still no one knows what's the staff level agreement between the government and IMF. I mean, IMF is not an organization that will dictate countries. I mean, there are countries who have very successfully negotiated with IMF. One example is Vietnam, who has gone through a very serious crisis situation, but now they are doing very well. So you can actually negotiate, because I mean, they are also professionals. No one still knows what's the staff level agreement between IMF and the government. So I mean, so we have to believe what the government says, but what we can really deduce is that after certain pressure, certain changes have been made. Today also there were some changes that were made. So I think it can be made flexible. Again, what professionals are asking is not about, we are not asking not to tax. It's not the case. We ask, what we are asking, we need a fair, equitable, just and transparent taxation system where the people of this country will be benefiting. That's what we want.
That's what you want. It's as simple as that.
It's not very simple, but I mean, argument is
a simple one.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Indika Karunathilake, for being on Newsline Live. And that's the way it was on Newsline Live this evening with Professor Indika Karunathilake. It's now time for the Primetime News. Take care, and God bless you all.
TV1. TV for life.
Newsfirst. Main sponsor.
Durden's Hospital.